will turn it over now. Oh, and the raffle, if you haven't put your name in yet, put your name in. It's a signed copy of her book. So do that as well before the end of the meeting. And I will turn it over to Krista. Thank you.
So yes, as Heather said, I'm Krista Van Laan. I'm the author of a recent book on the works of Frank Delos Wolfe, an architect who practiced in San Jose between 1888 and 1926. Frank Wolfe was a very popular architect in his day. He was well known across Northern California and widely published in national trade magazines. Both alone and with partners, he was responsible for well over 1,000 works during an architectural career that lasted about 35 years, which makes him one of the most prolific architects of all time. 8 of these works are today in the National Register of Historic Places. Tonight's program focuses on a 10-year period in Wolfe's career during which he designed prairie-style buildings, like this one, influenced by the great Midwestern architect Frank Lloyd Wright. These,
The lights.
yeah,
Yeah, they need the light.
yeah, let's do it. These houses, apartment buildings, and schools were something really new and bold in their time, virtually unheard of in California, and they were sought after by clients who wanted something unique. Luckily for us, most of the prairie houses still exist, and they're as outstanding today as they were when Wolfe introduced them in 1912. Finding a Wolfe building of any type is not as easy as some people think. A lot of people assume there's a list somewhere of everything he ever did, and all I have to do is look at that list. In fact, I'm usually the one building that list. And the way it's done is I go through old newspapers, trade magazines, and I look for announcements concerning Wolfe's work. I see who the client was, and then use census reports, sand-worn maps, and old directories to find their address. And then I drive by the building or look at it on Google Maps and see if it's still standing and if it looks like a Wolfe. But if the client's name was misspelled, as they often were, or the job wasn't put out for bid, we may never find out about the work. Even with that, using these tools and techniques, I've been able to find documented records of more than 1,000 works Wolfe did. And there are very many more that I believe are also from him that I've not yet been able to document. About 50 of these are prairie-style buildings still standing, most of them in San Jose, which makes it a major Western center for prairie architecture, considered by some to have more prairie-style buildings than any other city in California. Oopsie. So, what is prairie? It was a style that originated in Chicago in the 1890s, started by a group of young architects who wanted to come up with a style that was strictly American. Frank Lloyd Wright was the most famous of the prairie architects. And this house that Wright designed for Frederick Roby in Chicago really shows a lot of the features of prairie architecture. We've got the low-pitched or flat roof, deep overhanging eaves, horizontal lines, to the extent where a lot of the architects made a point of using highly contrasting mortar with the bricks to emphasize the horizontal lines. Open floor plan, clear story windows, which are windows that are above eye level, and horizontal bands of windows, frequently with geometric designs. They were also intended to harmonize with nature, so they blended in with the landscape, both in form and materials. And I think we would all agree that it's an amazing house to have been built in 1910. I'm going to show you just a couple more of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses. And as we go through the Wolfe designs, you'll see where he took his inspiration from, while still making the style his own. This one was done for Meyer May in Grand Rapids in 1908, which was right about the time that Frank Wolfe was looking at these designs. Balch House in Chicago, 1911. And this is Frank Wolfe. So we don't know a lot about Frank Wolfe. He left no autobiographical information to speak of, and there's nobody alive today who knew him. And unfortunately, except for one catalog of his work in 1907 with partner Charles McKenzie, he left no business records or records of his work, and no writings about his architectural philosophy. But we do know that he was a self-taught designer and architect from a long line of carpenters and craftsmen. He was ambitious in his life and work. He moved from Ohio, his birthplace, to Kansas and then to San Jose to create new opportunities for himself. He was eager to try new ideas. Pretty much everything I did read about him all said that he was trying to do something different. But he wasn't just a novelty act. He was an accomplished designer whose work has held up 100+ years. San Jose was booming when Frank Wolfe moved here in 1888 with his parents and siblings, his wife Nellie and baby son Carl, and there was tons of work for builders and would-be architects. In the early years, he designed and built a lot of houses in his attempt to establish himself as an architect. His wife Nellie handled the landscaping and the interior decor, and they would either sell it, or if it was something special, live in it for a year or two, and then do this again with another house. And this practice was something he continued for many, many years, both to showcase his talents and make money in real estate. This is one of the very early houses that Frank and Nellie Wolfe lived in San Jose. They lived in about 15 houses altogether. So in 1899, Wolfe formed a partnership with young architect Charles McKenzie, and I love this quote of his: "We're building a class of houses that will look both artistic and substantial years from now." And I think those two words best sum up his work. So Wolfe McKenzie developed a really distinctive style that is seen today all over historic neighborhoods throughout Northern California, and particularly, obviously, Santa Clara County. And their houses frequently defy architectural description. They mixed and matched stylistic elements in ways that only they could. And here we see many of the typical Wolfe and McKenzie features in this house designed for wealthy rancher Frederick Sanford in San Jose. We've got, the central dormer and a hipped roof, the very large porch with an off-center door, deep overhangs, and the house sometimes looks top-heavy because the second story projects over the porch. Cantilevered corner windows, and this design element that Wolfe and McKenzie used a lot, these narrowly spaced brackets below the projecting corner windows. If you see that on a house, it is almost always, but not totally always, a Wolfe and McKenzie. And then there's usually a balcony, either decorative or functional. So Wolfe and McKenzie designed many hundreds of houses during their 11 years together, and they also often designed commercial and public buildings. And this is one you may have all seen, the old City Hall in Gilroy, which really is a great example of what those two could do when they got together. Yeah. In the early 1900s, and I'm going to just go off a little bit from the prairies and Wolfe and the typical work of Wolfe and McKenzie, because I want to talk about how much work they did in Sunnyvale as Sunnyvale was being developed. So I had read in one book that Sunnyvale had little to no architectural residences in its early days in the early 1900s. Actually, Wolfe and McKenzie designed a huge number of commercial and residential designs for the people, for the movers and shakers of early Sunnyvale. This was the house for J.S. Unfortunately, most of them have been demolished. This was done for J.S. Spalding. He was the brother of Charles Spalding, who was one of the Sunnyvale Bank's presidents. And I believe that Charles Spalding had a Wolfe and McKenzie as well, but I haven't found total documentation to prove that. His first house was the second. This is the Sunnyvale Bank. And this is the Sunnyvale Bank now, sorry to say, but you know, another one of those really whimsical, interesting buildings. This house belonged to Walter E. Crossman, who was the founder of Sunnyvale. And unfortunately, it's really sad. It's in very bad shape now. But I think that's part of the reason that Wolfe and McKenzie did so much work in Sunnyvale at the time. Crossman had been a real estate man in San Jose before he came here, and he would have been very familiar with Wolfe and McKenzie's work and very aware of their reputation for fine residential design. And this is the same house from the Wolfe and McKenzie catalog I mentioned from 1907. Yeah, that's on Matilda Avenue, you might, you know, it's in pretty bad shape. It's still hanging in there. This house, and the reason it looks like Google Maps is because when I went out to take a photo of it a couple of years ago, it had just been demolished, was the Ryan's Hotel on Evelyn. And, you know, we see some of the typical Wolfe McKenzie features with the projecting windows and the interesting offset door here. And then this is a really nice example of Wolfe McKenzie's beautiful mission revival work. They did the original Libby McNeil and Libby Cannery in 1907. And I have one more here. This was, is now part of the, what's the mortuary called?
No, it's Bangor now.
No, it's a different one.
What street is it on?
Yeah, it's on Sunnyvale.
It's on Sunnyvale?
Yeah, North Sunnyvale.
Is that the one that was It used to be Smith and Wyatt, now Spalding.
Oh, Spangler.
Bangor.
Yeah.
Bangor now.
That's it.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is it's a poor photo. I couldn't get any better, but that's the original house, and it's now worked into the mortuary. But there are many other houses that they did in Sunnyvale as well. None of them are still standing, but quite a few buildings, and a couple others that I'm showing you later. So anyway, in the end of 1910, Wolfe and McKenzie dissolved their partnership, and Wolfe was looking around for a style to call his own. Both he and McKenzie were unwilling or unable to repeat any of the designs they had done when they were together. And Wolfe tried a bunch of styles that were popular at the time. For example, he did a number of these very beautiful Mission Revival homes, including this one for the prominent Pacho family in Santa Clara. This craftsman for the Hardings in Hollister. And a lot of large grand residences, like this one for the Burr family in Hayward. And the Burrs were wealthy heirs to a fortune. He was the grandson of the colorful three-time San Francisco mayor, Ephraim Burr. This house was originally intended to be 9 rooms, and by the time it was finished, it was 18. It's still in beautiful shape, maintained by the second family who's been taking care of it. I'm sure they don't do much else other than work on this house. But we see some of the beginnings of the Prairie influence here. We've got the horizontal lines, the heavy square pillars with contrasting caps, and the contrasting trim. So in 1912, Frank Wolfe startled locals by introducing the first of his Frank Lloyd Wright-inspired homes. He used the method that he had done his whole working career. He designed the house, his brother built it, and he and Nellie lived in it. This one was not just another spec house, though. They lived in it longer than any other home, for over 7 years. So Wolfe's Prairie homes were designed for Californians. Here's another view of this house. Unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, who frequently took a 2- or even 3-story house and made it look like 1 story, Wolfe often built a 1-story house and made it look like 2, with very, very high ceilings in the living room and the clear-story windows above. They were wide open, airy, and they let in the light. They had a lot of doors and a lot of windows, and were an early version of today's open concept. But to the extent where so many doors, I met one couple who said they had 7 doors in their kitchen, and they had closed some of them off. There were almost always huge plate glass windows in front of the house. And Wolfe was taking advantage of recent development in glass technology to come up with what became for him a signature feature. And you'll almost always see these giant windows in the early Wolfe Prairies. I have seen some of them that are 12 feet wide. And then